This is not a program for falling asleep. It is not a technique, a method, or a set of instructions to be followed in a particular order. It is closer to a quiet conversation, conducted in a room where the lights are low, where no one is waiting for an answer, where the thoughtful exploration of an idea is its own sufficient justification. The kind of conversation that good friends have sometimes, late in the evening, when the day's busyness has receded enough to allow for the kind of thinking that does not need to produce anything. If sleep comes, let it come. It will find you more easily when it is not being pursued. If thought continues, let it continue. The mind's movement is not an obstacle to what this hour can offer. What matters is not where you are when this ends, but how the mind holds itself along the way, and whether that holding has something of understanding in it, some quality of perspective that makes the movement feel less like agitation and more like the natural behavior of a complex and sensitive instrument. So, the mind is moving. Let us begin by asking why, and asking it without urgency, as a genuine philosophical inquiry into the nature of a universal human experience. Consider water for a moment. Not a still lake or a glass on a table, but a river, or a stream, or the contents of a bowl that has just been stirred. Water that has been set in motion does not stop the moment you remove your hand, or the force that started it moving. It continues moving, circling, slowing by degrees, following the paths that have been cut into it by the force that initiated the movement. The circles diminish in their intensity. The turbulence at the surface gradually calms. But this process takes time, and it happens on the water's terms, not on the terms imposed by whatever force originally disturbed it. There is a physical truth here that applies equally well to thought. Momentum is not only a property of physical objects, it is a property of minds. A mind that has been set in motion, that has been active and engaged and responsive for many hours, does not stop that motion simply because the body has become horizontal and the lights have been extinguished. The momentum of the day's thinking carries forward into the night, diminishing gradually, following its natural arc, but present nonetheless. The day has been long, not necessarily dramatic or difficult, though it may have been those things. It has simply been full, in the way that ordinary days are full, with movement and decision and conversation, and the small navigations that make up the texture of a life, with the management of tasks that required judgment, and the maintenance of relationships that required attention, and the 100 micro-adjustments that living among other people in a complex world requires. All of that activity required your mind to move, to be directed, to make choices between competing considerations, to hold multiple threads simultaneously, to switch between different registers of attention throughout the hours. That movement does not stop because you have stopped. Think of it this way. A person named Eleanor has spent her day in the complicated middle of her life. She is a project manager for a mid-sized company, thoughtful and capable, the kind of person who anticipates problems before they become crises, and who carries a quiet but genuine responsibility for the work of other people. She has been doing this all day, sometimes on the phone, sometimes in a meeting room with colleagues, sometimes alone at her desk, with a screen and a cooling cup of coffee, and the particular focused silence of a person working through something complex. She manages by thinking ahead, by modeling scenarios, by keeping multiple threads active simultaneously in her mind. She left the office at a reasonable hour. She made dinner. She talked with someone she loves about ordinary things. She brushed her teeth, changed into soft clothes, and lowered herself into bed with the reasonable expectation that the day had ended and that sleep would come presently. And her mind continued managing. It did not receive the signal that there was no longer a problem to anticipate, because the mind does not receive signals of that kind. There is no switch. The activity of the day trained the mind to continue in its mode of active, forward-looking engagement. And so it continues into the quiet of the night, doing what it has been doing, which is to track open threads, model tomorrow's requirements, identify potential complications, and maintain the general state of readiness that a day of responsibility requires. The meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning assembles itself in her thoughts, with all its attendant details and possibilities and potential difficulties. The email she did not quite finish composing resurfaces. The longer-term project, with its shifting requirements, asks, gently but persistently, to be re-examined. Elena lies in the dark and is, in a very real sense, still at work. This is the first thing to understand, with genuine clarity. Mental momentum is real. It has a physical substrate in the patterns of neural activation that sustained thinking produces. Those patterns do not rearrange themselves instantly. They require time and the right conditions to settle into something quieter. The mind that spent the day in engaged, forward-moving thought will spend at least the early part of the night in some continuation of that movement. This is not weakness. It is not a failure of discipline or self-regulation. It is the entirely predictable and physiologically explicable consequence of having spent a day in sustained, demanding cognitive work. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher who wrote his private reflections in a notebook that was never intended for other eyes, who wrote them in the field during military campaigns, and at night during periods of political pressure and difficulty, put it this way in one of his most direct observations. The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. The phrase that carries the most weight here is the second one. Look things in the face and know them for what they are. This is not a call to stoicism in the popular sense, the gritting of teeth and the refusal of feeling. It is something more careful, more intelligent than that. It is an invitation to see clearly, to name accurately, to resist the powerful temptation to add unnecessary layers of judgment or fear or self-criticism to what is simply and straightforwardly happening. The mind is moving. That is what is happening. When Elena lies in the dark and feels her thoughts continuing their forward motion, the first and most honest response to that experience is simply to recognize it for what it is, not as evidence that she is constitutionally incapable of switching off, not as a sign that her day was too full or her life too demanding, not as a personal failing that better people would not experience, but as mental momentum. The day set something in motion. That thing is still in motion. It will slow. This is not a reassurance offered to make her feel better in a vague or sentimental way. It is a physical description of how cognitive activity works. The settling is coming. It comes for everyone, eventually. Fighting it, or adding the secondary anxiety of being unable to sleep on top of the primary movement of thought, simply introduces a new agitation into the system, a new layer of motion that adds to rather than reduces the overall activity. The night has its own pace. The body knows this pace. Even when the mind is still moving, the body is already doing its work of repair and restoration, already in the process of the physical recovery that sleep enables and that complete wakefulness prevents. You do not have to achieve perfect stillness of mind for the body to rest. The two can proceed on different schedules, in the same quiet room, without conflict. The light has changed, outside whatever window your room has. The world has entered its other mode, the one that runs parallel to the waking one, slower and stranger, populated by different creatures with different orientations to the dark. You are somewhere between those two modes right now, carried by the body toward rest but held, for now, in the gentle traction of a still moving mind. The traction will ease. The movement will slow. In the meantime, there is a way of being in this in-between space that is neither helpless nor forceful. That way is what we are exploring together. That is exactly where this reflection begins. In the ordinary, universal, and philosophically rich experience of a moving mind in a quiet room at the end of a full day. There is something very old inside the human tendency to anticipate trouble, to model future scenarios, to rehearse possible difficulties before they arrive, something that predates philosophy by an enormous margin, something that predates written language and perhaps language itself, in all likelihood. The neural architecture that generates worry and preparation and the mental rehearsal of future scenarios was shaped over geological stretches of time, long before anyone sat down to think carefully about what the mind was doing when it did these things, and why, and whether the results justified the cost. That architecture was not shaped by comfort. It was shaped by danger, by the recurring need to model threats before they arrived, to imagine what might go wrong before it actually went wrong, to run through possible futures in advance in order to select the behaviors most likely to produce survival rather than its opposite. Consider what it meant in the environment in which this capacity developed, to have a mind that would not stop anticipating. That mind spotted the predator before it was close enough to be a certainty. That mind stored the knowledge of last season's food scarcity and applied it to the preparation for this one. That mind rehearsed the social encounter before it happened, gaming out the best approaches to a negotiation or a conflict before being in the middle of one. In that context, mental restlessness was not a problem to be managed. It was an advantage, a feature, a reliable producer of survival-relevant outputs. The sleepless cave dweller, who spent part of the night running through possible dangers, was better prepared for the morning than the one who slept without interruption through all available hours. Anticipation was protective. The mind that would not stop planning was the mind that kept you alive, and kept the people in your care alive, and kept the group functioning through the difficulties that the environment continuously presented. We carry that mind inside us now, in a world that looks almost nothing like the one in which it was formed. The dangers are different. They are slower, more abstract, more social, more financial, more institutional. They operate over longer time horizons. They often involve other minds rather than natural forces. But the mechanism that responds to them is substantially unchanged. When the mind perceives something uncertain, something that requires navigation, something with multiple possible outcomes and significant personal stakes, it does what it evolved to do. It models, it rehearses, it runs variations, it builds scenarios and inhabits them and tests them and revises them. It tries to produce, through the sheer force of its own sustained activity, a certainty that the future consistently refuses to provide. Consider a man named James. He is in his mid-40s, thoughtful and somewhat quiet in his manner, a person who takes his responsibilities seriously and who derives a significant portion of his sense of himself from his professional capability. He's facing what he privately thinks of as a crossroads, though he would not say the word aloud because it feels too large, too dramatic for the ordinary uncertainty of a middle-career moment. His company is reorganizing. His position is secure, probably, but probably is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and he knows it. There are options on the table, or options he imagines might be placed on the table, and each option has a different set of consequences fanning out from it in multiple directions. Implications for income and status and daily experience and long-term trajectory. And each set of consequences has its own uncertainties nested within it. James goes to bed, and his mind immediately begins walking those paths. Not randomly, very specifically. He moves through one scenario with considerable care and attention, examining what it might mean in practical terms for his income, for the work he would be doing, for his status among colleagues, for his own private sense of himself as a competent and capable person, for his wife's reaction when he tells her, for the practical arrangements of their daily life. He finds a potential difficulty embedded in the scenario, and his mind returns, reflex-like, to the beginning of the analysis. He tries a different scenario. He finds another potential difficulty, of a different kind, with different implications. He returns to the first scenario to check whether he resolved the difficulty he found there the first time through. He has not, because that difficulty was not a problem that could be solved through further examination. It was a problem that required information that did not yet exist, decisions that had not yet been made by people who were not James, and who had not yet made up their minds. But the problem-solving mechanism does not know this, or if it knows it in some intellectual sense, it does not believe it in the felt sense that would allow the search to stop, and so it continues. The loop that the problem-solving mechanism evolved to execute is this: apply thought to difficulty, find resolution, act. That loop is deeply satisfying when it works. When the thought produces a plan, and the plan produces an action, and the action produces a result. The satisfaction of closing a genuine loop, of working through a problem to its solution, is one of the most reliable pleasures available to a thoughtful mind. The loop becomes strained and then painful when thought is applied to a problem that does not yield to it, when the future stubbornly refuses to be pinned down by analysis, when the scenarios that the mind builds never quite stabilize because they are built from incomplete information about things that have not yet happened. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French mathematician physicist and philosopher, was a person of extraordinary intellectual capacity who spent significant portions of his life in genuine spiritual and philosophical struggle. His observations about the human condition were not theoretical exercises. They were drawn from a careful and sometimes painful attention to his own interior life and to the lives of those around him. He wrote in his Pensées, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." This is one of those sentences that sounds almost too simple until you hold it for a while, without rushing to agree or disagree. Pascal was not saying that stillness is easy, or that people are foolish for failing to achieve it. He was not issuing a criticism. He was pointing to something structural in human experience, something that he observed in himself as much as in anyone else. The mind resists its own rest. It reaches outward and forward. It seeks problems to manage, futures to plan, scenarios to rehearse, social calculations to run, because that reaching is what it was built for, what it was selected for across enormous spans of time. To sit quietly, without grasping at a problem, without filling the available space with useful, or at least plausibly useful activity, feels to the mind like a kind of failure, a dereliction of its primary function. There is a discomfort in pure stillness that is not merely culturally produced. It is something older than culture. James, lying in the dark and mapping his professional future across the ceiling, is not being irrational. He's not doing something that a better or more disciplined version of himself would not do. He is executing the program that his mind was written to execute, responding to a genuine uncertainty with the cognitive tools that the mind provides. The difficulty is that the program is running without the data it needs to complete its loop, and so it runs again and again, circling back through the same terrain with the same insufficient information. Each pass feeling as though it might this time yield the clarity that the previous passes did not provide. Pascal's insight was not a cure. He was not offering a technique for becoming the kind of person who can sit quietly in a room. He was performing a diagnosis, noting what he observed in himself and in others, naming the restlessness with the precision that good philosophy provides. There is something genuinely relieving in that naming. The inability to sit quietly in a room is not James's personal peculiarity, not a sign of an unusually anxious constitution or an unusually difficult life. It is woven into the structure of human consciousness, noticed by one of the most precise and rigorous minds of the 17th century, and by thinkers in every era before and after him. The company is wide and distinguished. James is not broken. He is human, in a situation that calls forth a response that is entirely natural and that has been serving the species reliably for much longer than it has been inconveniencing any particular individual at 2 a.m. The distinction between broken and human is not trivial. It changes the emotional quality of the experience, at least somewhat, when you recognize that what you are experiencing is not a malfunction, but a function, an ancient and reliable function that is simply operating in a context that is different from the one it was designed for. There is a further question here that deserves some attention. What would it mean to understand this more fully? Not just to know it as a piece of information, but to have it genuinely available, to feel the recognition when the loop starts again, and to hold it with that recognition, rather than from within the loop. What would shift if James could approach his circling thoughts about the reorganization with the clear understanding that more running of the program will not produce the certainty that the future is withholding, because the certainty does not exist yet and cannot be produced through any amount of prior preparation. We will come to that question more fully as we move through these ideas. For now, it is enough to rest in the simple acknowledgement. The mind trying to plan and solve and prepare is doing something very natural, driven by something very old. The restlessness you feel at night is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a mechanism that runs reliably, sometimes helpfully, sometimes in empty circles, but always for reasons that go back much further than this particular evening, this particular uncertainty, this particular person lying in this particular dark. There is a kind of companionship in knowing that. The mind is doing what it was shaped to do. We can watch it do that thing with some curiosity, even some appreciation for the mechanism itself, rather than fighting it as though it were an intruder. One of the more genuinely comforting discoveries available to a thoughtful person is the realization that whatever interior difficulty they are experiencing, someone has been there before. Not metaphorically or approximately before, actually before, in a different century, in a different language, with a different set of surface circumstances, but the same interior weather. The wandering mind at night, the circular thinking, the way uncertainty expands to fill the available quiet. These are not inventions of modernity. They are as old as reflective consciousness itself. The moment human beings developed the capacity to think about the future and model possible outcomes, they also acquired the capacity to be kept awake by that thinking. The two capabilities are inseparable. You cannot have the foresight without the anxiety. You cannot have the planning capacity without the late-night rehearsal. The extraordinary gift of forward-thinking consciousness comes with the late-night cost of forward-thinking consciousness. And this has been the case for as long as there have been minds sufficiently developed to contemplate their own motion. The Stoics wrote about this with remarkable precision, in a way that has the quality of people describing something they knew well from the inside, rather than something they had observed only from the outside. Epictetus, a philosopher who was born into slavery in the Roman province of Phrygia in the 1st century of the Common Era, and who eventually became one of the most influential teachers of his time, understood the restless mind as one of the central practical problems of human life. His entire philosophy was, in many ways, an attempt to address it from the inside, to develop a relationship with the mind's movement that was neither helpless surrender nor futile resistance. He wrote in his Enchiridion, a text that has been read by thoughtful people in every subsequent century. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. For example, death is nothing terrible, else it would have appeared so to Socrates. But the terror consists in our opinion of death, that it is terrible. This deserves to be thought about slowly and without impatience, because it is easy to hear it as a dismissal of real difficulty, as though Epictetus were saying that distress is simply a matter of thinking wrong thoughts, that the solution is to decide to think differently, and everything will immediately improve. That reading makes his insight sound both simpler and harsher than it is, and it misses the careful philosophical observation at its heart. What Epictetus was pointing to was something structural about the relationship between events and their interpretation. The thing that disturbs you at night is rarely the raw fact of a situation in its bare simplicity. It is the interpretation of the fact, the weight you give it, the meaning you construct around it, the narrative you build in which the uncertain outcome represents a threat to something you hold valuable. The event by itself is neutral data. The mind adds the disturbance through the machinery of interpretation. The meeting tomorrow is simply a meeting, a scheduled gathering of people at a particular time. The disturbance is not in the meeting. The disturbance is in the accumulated interpretations. This could go badly, and if it goes badly, it will reflect on my competence. And if it reflects on my competence, that might damage my standing. And if it damages my standing, that might affect my future, and so on. Each link in the chain being an interpretation, a projection, a story built on top of the simple fact. Epictetus was not saying the chain is trivial, or that the concerns are unjustified. He was saying the chain is built from something different than the initial fact. And if the chain is built from something the mind constructs, then the mind has some relationship to its constructions that is different from its relationship to the external events themselves. There is a degree of authorship in the interpretation. That authorship is where the philosophical attention belongs, across a different tradition, speaking from a different geography and a different set of assumptions about the nature of mind and world and the purpose of philosophical inquiry. The Buddhist teachings arrive at something remarkably similar in its practical implications. The Dhammapada, one of the oldest and most widely read collections of Buddhist verse, compiled from the oral tradition and committed to writing in the Pali language, opens with these words: Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, suffering follows as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox. If one speaks or acts with a serene mind, happiness follows as a shadow that never departs. The image of the wheel following the hoof is precise in a way that a more abstract formulation would not be. The wheel does not choose to follow the hoof. It follows by the nature of what it is and how it is attached. The suffering that follows from the corrupt or disturbed mind is equally non-voluntary in a certain sense. It is the natural consequence of the mind's condition, following as surely as the wheel follows the ox. But notice the second image, the shadow that never departs. Happiness following from the serene mind is described not as an achievement that requires effort, but as something that follows naturally, without special action, from the right condition of mind. The shadow does not follow the person because the person works hard to maintain it. It follows because of the relationship between the light and the person, a relationship that produces the shadow as an automatic and effortless consequence. The serene mind does not produce peace through effort. It reveals peace as its natural accompaniment. This is a significantly different model from the one that the modern, striving mind tends to adopt. The striving mind says, I will achieve peace by doing the right things, thinking the right thoughts, managing my mind into the correct configuration. The Buddhist teaching says, "The peace is already present. The disturbed mind obscures it, the way sediment obscures clear water." Now consider the great Taoist text, the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, whose origins lie somewhere in the 4th or 5th century before the Common Era, and which has been continuously read and translated and contemplated in every subsequent century. Laozi was not interested in the systematic analysis of mental processes. He was interested in the quality of relationship between the person and the flow of things, between the individual and what the Taoists called the Tao, the underlying pattern or principle of how things move and change. He wrote, "Knowing others is wisdom. Knowing the self is enlightenment. Mastering others requires force. Mastering the self requires strength. The distinction here between force and strength is not decorative. Force is external, applied from outside the thing being affected. Strength is internal, a quality of the thing itself. The mastery of the self that Laozi describes is not achieved by forcing the mind into silence through willpower. It is achieved through a quality of self-knowledge, of genuine understanding, that changes the relationship between the person and their own mental activity without requiring a battle against it. Eleanor, lying in the quiet room, is in the company of an ancient recognition. The Roman emperor, writing by candlelight in his field tent. The freed slave teaching philosophy to anyone who would listen. The Chinese sage, who may or may not have been a single historical person, but whose insights have been transmitted across 2,500 years. The Buddhist compilers recording what they understood to be the observations of an enlightened mind about the nature of mental experience. None of them would be surprised to find her awake at this hour with a moving mind. All of them would recognize it immediately. They would not, however, respond to it with the mixture of frustration and self-criticism that the modern person often brings to the experience of lying awake. They would respond to it with the quality that their philosophical traditions cultivated: observation, understanding, a patient and clear-eyed recognition of what is happening and why. There is also Pascal, 3 centuries ago, writing about his own inability to remain still. There is Schopenhauer in the 19th century, mapping the structure of desire and suffering with a precision that was informed by his reading of Buddhist texts, as well as by the Western philosophical tradition he inherited. There is the French essayist Montaigne in the 16th century, describing the way his mind wandered and leapt and refused to stay in any single place for long, and treating that wandering with a warm curiosity rather than a demanding discipline. You are resting in the company of an enormous tradition of careful thought about precisely this experience: the moving mind at night, the thoughts that will not resolve, the future that insists on being anticipated. These have been the occupation of philosophy, in one form or another, since philosophy began. You are not alone in this experience. You are not uniquely afflicted. You are participating in what is arguably the most universal interior experience that thoughtful, self-aware human beings share. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The solidarity of it. The long lineage of people who have lain in the dark with thoughts that continued moving, and who found, in that experience, the occasion for some of the most valuable insights into the nature of mind and self, and what it means to live with intelligence in an uncertain world. There is a phrase that appears in various forms across Stoic philosophy, a conceptual pivot around which much of that tradition turns, the distinction that gives the whole system its practical orientation. Epictetus articulated it most clearly at the very opening of his Enchiridion. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. The distinction sounds, at first, almost too obvious to merit the weight that the Stoics gave it. Of course, some things are in our control and some are not. Everyone knows this. But knowing it as a general principle is quite different from actually inhabiting it, from applying it with genuine precision to the specific anxieties that arise in specific circumstances. The Stoic practice was not the intellectual recognition of the distinction, but the repeated, disciplined, practical application of it to the actual texture of experience. What Epictetus is doing when he draws this line is inviting the listener to take the line seriously enough to actually examine, in the specific instance of each concern, where that concern falls. Is the thing I am anxious about something within my sphere of action, or is it something that lies outside that sphere, in the domain of other minds, future events, natural processes, institutional decisions? If it lies outside, what exactly do I expect to achieve by directing sustained attention toward it through the night? Tonight, somewhere, a person is lying awake, thinking about what another person thinks of them. Not about what they have said or done, which might be within their power to address, but about the actual interior state of another mind, which is entirely beyond their access or influence. Tonight, someone is anxious about an outcome that will be determined by a committee, or a vote, or a board decision, or the state of a market, or the health of an economy, or the mood of someone they will never meet. Tonight, someone is rehearsing a conversation that has not happened, imagining the other person's responses with considerable confidence and emotional vividness, then constructing their own responses to the imagined responses, then imagining further responses to those, in an increasingly elaborate simulation of a social encounter that will almost certainly not unfold in the manner being simulated. All of this has the texture of useful activity. It feels like preparation. It feels like the responsible engagement of a conscientious person with concerns that genuinely matter. But from the perspective that Epictetus is offering, most of it is attention flowing toward what he would call the things not in our control, which will accept all of that attention without providing what the attention is seeking, which is resolution, certainty, a felt sense of having managed the unmanageable into something manageable. Consider Priya. She is 27 years old, capable and hard-working, and she has applied for a graduate program at a university that matters to her, in a field she has been moving toward for several years. She has submitted everything that was asked of her. She has done it with care and thought and the honest presentation of her actual capabilities and interests. The application is complete. The decision now rests with people she does not know, who will read materials she has already produced, according to criteria that she can only partially imagine, in a process whose inner workings are opaque to her. There is nothing more she can do in relation to the outcome. This is simply and straightforwardly true. And yet, at 2 a.m, she is running the application through her mind again, with the intensity of someone who believes that one more pass might reveal something that could still be changed or improved, even though nothing can be changed or improved, even though the submission is complete, and the only thing that can happen now is waiting for a decision she has no power to influence. She is wondering whether a particular sentence in her personal statement sounded confident or arrogant to the reader. She is revisiting a choice she made about which work samples to include. She is imagining the admissions committee, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, reading her file. She's calculating probabilities based on partial information about acceptance rates and the likely quality of competing applicants she has never met. From the Epictetan perspective, almost everything she is doing in these late-night hours is directed toward something entirely outside her control. The committee's decision is not in her power. Their impressions are not in her power. The quality of other applications is not in her power. Even her own past choices, embedded in the submitted application, are no longer in her power, because the application is complete and cannot be changed. What is in her power right now is her relationship to the waiting, how she holds the uncertainty, what story she tells herself about what the uncertainty means, what claim she allows the uncertainty to make on her peace. This is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only genuinely available freedom in her current situation, and Epictetus would say that it is, in some important sense, the only thing that was ever truly hers in the first place. Marcus Aurelius, who faced uncertainties of a considerably larger scale than the outcomes of graduate applications, returned again and again to this distinction in his private writings. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The word strength here is important. Not peace, not comfort, not the absence of difficulty. Strength, something that allows you to act well in the face of what cannot be controlled, rather than being destabilized by it. The Stoic understanding was not that the uncontrollable doesn't matter. It was that how you hold yourself in relation to the uncontrollable determines the quality of your experience in a way that the events themselves cannot, because your relationship to events is something you have genuine access to, even when the events themselves are beyond your reach. Schopenhauer, observing the same human tendency from a different philosophical tradition and a different century, wrote with characteristically unsparing precision, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." This sentence stops thought for a moment if you let it. You can choose your actions within the available space of your freedom, but the wanting itself, the direction and intensity of desire, the particular anxieties that surface at 2 a.m, the specific things that feel urgent and the specific things that feel trivial, these are not themselves the products of deliberate choice. You did not decide to care about the graduate program. The caring arose in you from the combination of your history, your values, your sense of what would constitute a good life for you. You cannot simply decide not to care, any more than you can decide not to be cold when the temperature drops. What you can do, and what the philosophers across many traditions have pointed toward with considerable consistency, is change your relationship to the caring. Not suppress the wanting, but hold it differently. Not pretend indifference, but release the identification between your well-being and the outcome. Not stop caring about whether the program accepts you, but stop making your peace conditional on the acceptance. These are not easy adjustments. They are not made once through an act of intellectual recognition, and then maintained effortlessly forever. They are practices, orientations, ways of returning, applied in the particular context of each new situation and each new night. Priya will care about the outcome. That is not going to change tonight. But there is a difference between caring and being held captive by the caring. And that difference, however subtle, is where the philosophers located the possibility of genuine equanimity. The room holds her. The decision will come when it comes. Between now and then, there is tonight, and tonight is whole and complete in itself, not a waiting room for a more important moment, but the actual texture of her actual life happening now, available to be lived rather than consumed by the anticipation of something that has not yet happened and may not happen in the way she imagines. There is a distinction that appears in different vocabularies across many philosophical traditions, one that points consistently toward the same underlying recognition when you trace it carefully. It is the distinction between the content of thought and the awareness within which thought arises and passes. It is the difference between the river and the riverbank, between the weather and the sky, between the thoughts themselves and the capacity to observe that thinking is happening. This distinction is straightforward to state. It is considerably less straightforward to actually experience as a felt reality, rather than as an intellectual position. The attempt to feel it, to locate it in actual experience, rather than merely understanding it as a concept, is something that takes practice in the formal sense. But even the attempt changes something. Even the orientation toward the distinction, however incomplete, begins to shift the relationship between the person and their thoughts in ways that have real consequences. Most of the time, when we are inside a stream of thought, we are not aware of the stream as a stream. We are the stream. There is no gap between the thinker and the thought. When Elena is running through tomorrow's meeting, she is not watching herself think about the meeting from some stable vantage point. She is inside the thinking, inside the scenario, absorbed in the details and implications of the imagined future. Her emotional responses moving with the imagined events, as though those events were actually occurring. The thinking is seamless, total, unexamined. Buddhist philosophy gave this seamless absorption a name, though the name varies across translations. It is sometimes called identification, sometimes grasping, sometimes simply the untrained quality of a mind that has not yet developed the capacity to observe its own activity. The untrained mind, in this framework, is not a damaged or defective mind. It is simply a mind that has not yet discovered a particular capacity that is available to it, the capacity to step back, however fractionally, from complete absorption in its contents, and to know that thinking is happening rather than simply being entirely inside the thinking. The Dhammapada returns to this theme repeatedly, using the image of the trained mind as a mind that holds itself differently in relation to its own activity. Not a mind without thought, but a mind with a different relationship to thought. The monk in the forest, described by the early Buddhist texts, is not a person who has emptied his head of content. He's a person who has developed what might be described as a witness quality, a capacity to observe the arising of thought, to note it, and to allow it to pass without being entirely swept away by it. Marcus Aurelius, in the privacy of his philosophical notebook, approached this from a slightly different angle. He wrote, "Confine yourself to the present." And elsewhere, "Look well into thyself. There is a source of strength, which will always spring up if thou wilt always look." That phrase, "look well into thyself," points toward a quality of self-examination that is different from the self-absorption of worry. Worry is about the contents of thought, about the scenarios and their implications, and the possibilities they suggest. Looking into oneself, in the sense Marcus Aurelius intends, is about the nature of the mental activity itself, the observation of how the mind moves, what it does, what drives it, what it is actually doing when it spins through its anxious rehearsals. When James is lying in the dark running his career scenarios, he is fully identified with the content of the thinking. He is the thinker. The thoughts feel like they are reporting a genuine external reality, mapping a terrain that actually exists and that requires careful navigation. The anxiety that accompanies the thinking feels like an entirely appropriate response to genuine danger. The urgency to keep thinking feels like a real and legitimate demand from the situation itself. All of these feelings are understandable. They are the natural accompaniments of full identification with the thinking. But there is another possibility available to him, one that requires a shift that is genuinely difficult to describe, but that is recognizable when it occurs. It is the possibility of noticing that the thinking is happening, of stepping back, even fractionally, from the seamless identification with the stream, and becoming aware that there is cognitive activity occurring, that he is watching thoughts arise one after another in a mind that produces them continuously, that the thoughts, however compelling and however emotionally charged, are not the future itself. They are the mind's representations of possible futures, built from memory and projection and emotional significance. They are models, not the territory they model. This fractional step back does not resolve the uncertainty. It does not make the career situation less real or less significant. It does not remove the concern or pretend that the outcome does not matter. What it does is create a small amount of space between the person and the stream. And in that space, something like genuine observation can begin. The observing quality of mind can look at the thinking mind and say, with some accuracy, there is thinking happening here. There has been thinking happening here for some time. The thinking is doing something, and I can see it doing that thing, and I am not entirely the same as the thing I am seeing. The Buddhist tradition developed elaborate and systematic practices around this capacity, practices of sustained attention to the arising and passing of mental events, training the mind to recognize thoughts as thoughts rather than as transparent windows onto an external reality that must be urgently managed. These practices, in their formal versions, require dedicated time and guidance and sustained effort over months and years. But you do not need a formal practice to recognize the experience of stepping back from full identification with thought, because most people have experienced it spontaneously, in the middle of a worry, or in the middle of an argument, or in the middle of a conversation that suddenly becomes strange from the outside. The moment of recognition in the middle of a worry loop, the sudden awareness that you have been circling the same territory for some time, that the loop is a loop and not a solution, that you are watching yourself do something you have watched yourself do before. That moment is a naturally occurring instance of the distinction we are exploring. The one who recognizes the loop is not identical to the loop itself. Something has stepped back, however briefly, however partially. Something has looked at the movement from a position outside the movement. That moment is itself a small liberation. Not a complete one, not a permanent one, not an arrival at the meditative states described in classical Buddhist literature. Simply a momentary gap between the absorbed thinker and the observed thought. In that gap, the grip of urgency eases, however slightly. The thoughts do not vanish. The concern remains. But the relationship to them shifts, and the shift carries a quality of relief that is disproportionate to its apparent simplicity. Epictetus built his entire teaching around the cultivation of this gap. The student of philosophy was asked again and again to pause before reacting, to insert a moment of conscious reflection between the stimulus and the response, to ask, what is this thing that has appeared? Is it within my sphere of action or not? That pause is not a pause before a different action. It is itself a practice of awareness. It is the cultivation of a gap between the event and the identification with the interpretation of the event, between the thought and the seamless inhabiting of the thought. The gap is where understanding lives. The gap is where the philosophical insights we have been exploring have their practical home. All of the careful observations of the Stoics and the Taoists and the Buddhist thinkers, all of Pascal's precise diagnosis of the problem of sitting quietly in a room, all of Schopenhauer's analysis of desire and suffering. These are ideas that live in the gap between the observed thought and the observing awareness. They do not change the contents of thought. They change the relationship to the contents. They make it possible, at least some of the time, to be with the thoughts differently. Elena is lying in the dark. She notices, perhaps for the first time in this hour, that she has been thinking about the meeting for some extended stretch of time, not just experiencing the thoughts, but actually noticing them from some small degree of distance as thoughts. The noticing is not the same kind of activity as the thinking. There is a quality of observation in it that the absorbed worrying did not have. For a moment, briefly, she is watching the stream rather than being entirely inside it. The stream continues. But something has changed in the quality of her relationship to it. In the Tao Te Ching, a quality appears repeatedly across many chapters, described through different images, but always pointing toward the same underlying recognition. It is the quality of wu wei, a term that resists easy translation and that has been rendered variously as non-action, effortless action, acting in accordance with nature, or simply as the virtue of not forcing. Wu wei is not passive inertia. It is not the avoidance of action. It is something more subtle, a way of being responsive to natural movement rather than imposing upon it, a willingness to allow things their own unfolding, rather than substituting deliberate force for the movement that things naturally tend toward. Laozi wrote, "To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders." The word surrenders is interesting and worth examining. It does not mean the universe is conquered, dominated, brought under control. It means something closer to, becomes visible, becomes available, becomes knowable in its actual nature, rather than in the distorted form produced by agitated observation. The river observed from the bank reveals its patterns, its currents, its pace, its relationship to the banks and the bottom, and the sky above. The person who enters the river and struggles against the current cannot see the river in the same way, because the struggle occupies all available attention and replaces the river with the immediate demands of not drowning. The application to the restless mind at night is not immediate or automatic, but it is genuine and worth pursuing slowly. The mind that fights its own restlessness, that treats every circling thought as an enemy to be expelled through sheer willpower, that tries to force itself into quietness through the application of deliberate effort, is doing something that tends to amplify rather than reduce the movement it is trying to stop. Resistance to the movement is itself movement. Fighting thoughts generates mental activity. Trying to force the mind to be quiet is itself a loud kind of trying. Zhuangzi, whose philosophical writings extend and elaborate, and sometimes playfully undermine the Taoist tradition in ways that are simultaneously profound and entertaining, offered an image of water finding its own level. Water, when disturbed, moves chaotically. It splashes, it eddies, it creates turbulence that makes the whole surface opaque and agitated. But water is not chaotic by nature. Its nature is stillness, is finding its level, is settling into the configuration that its context allows. The settling is not something water achieves through effort. It is something water returns to when the disturbing forces withdraw. Zhuangzi wrote, in one of his characteristically oblique and luminous observations, "Flow with whatever is happening, and let your mind be free. Stay centered by accepting whatever you are doing. This is the ultimate. Flow with whatever is happening, not resist it, not force it in a different direction, not evaluate it according to whether it matches the preferred outcome. Flow with it. Accept the current state of things not as a permanent condition, but as the immediate reality within which the next moment will unfold. This is not resignation. It is something more like clear-eyed presence, an orientation toward what is rather than toward the battle with what is. There is a practical implication here for the experience of lying awake with a moving mind. The mind is moving. That is the current reality. Fighting that reality, treating it as something that should not be happening, and that must be forcibly corrected, introduces a secondary agitation into the system. Now there is not only the original movement of thought, but also the resistance to the movement, the frustration with the movement, the evaluation of the movement as a failure, and all the further thoughts that those secondary responses generate. What the Taoist orientation suggests, instead, is something more like allowing. Not forcing stillness, but ceasing to force the opposite of stillness. Not making the mind stop, but releasing the pressure that has been holding it in an artificially accelerated state. The momentum of thought, when it is not continually fed by resistance or by anxious engagement, has its own natural arc toward slower and slower movement. It does not maintain its intensity indefinitely. It is not a perpetual motion machine. It runs toward quieter movement the way water runs toward its level, given sufficient time and the right conditions. This is not instruction. It is closer to observation, a description of something that tends to happen under certain conditions in a particular direction, that can be supported or interfered with, but that cannot really be forced. You cannot force the mind to be quiet any more than you can force water to be still by slapping the surface repeatedly. You can create the conditions within which the natural quieting proceeds without impediment. James, having spent an hour in circular career planning, faces a choice at some point in the night. He can redouble the effort, approach the same scenarios again with more intensity, hoping this next pass will finally extract the certainty that the previous passes withheld. Or he can, with some degree of conscious recognition, simply notice that the thinking has been circling, that it is going to continue circling for as long as he actively engages with it, and that the alternative is not a different and better kind of thinking, but the gentle withdrawal of the quality of effortful engagement. This withdrawal is subtle and worth describing carefully, because it is not the same as trying to stop thinking, which produces only more thinking. It is more like changing what you are doing with the thoughts. Instead of following each thought to its conclusion, building the scenario out in full detail, populating it with faces and conversations and implications, you allow the thought to arise. You notice it briefly without climbing into it, and you allow it to pass without having pursued it to its terminus. You do not silence the thought. You decline the invitation to inhabit it fully. Some thoughts resist this with considerable insistence. Some thoughts arrive with an urgency that makes the suggestion of allowing them to pass feel almost irresponsible, as though passing them by were a failure of adequate seriousness about real concerns. Those thoughts, notably, are often the ones most worth allowing to pass, because their urgency is a quality generated by the anxious mind, and not a reliable signal from external reality. The urgency of 2 a.m. rarely tracks accurately the importance of the matter being worried about. The mind in its activated state produces urgency, the way an overheated engine produces heat, as a symptom of its own condition, not as an accurate report of the external environment. There is a quality of evening light that painters have loved across centuries, and that most people recognize immediately, even if they have never thought to name it. It is the quality of light at the edge of dusk, after the sun has moved below the horizon, but before the sky has completed its transition to dark. The light is horizontal and soft and indirect. It falls across ordinary surfaces at a different angle than the direct light of midday, revealing textures that the overhead light conceals, creating a depth of appearance in common things that makes them look slightly more than ordinary. It does not illuminate with the clarity of noon, but with a lateral tenderness that asks nothing. The mind in its later night hours, when the initial momentum of the day has been gradually releasing its intensity for some time, has something of that quality available to it. The thoughts that come are softer, less defined, more associative. They begin to lose their narrative coherence. The forward-moving, logical structure of the earlier worry loops starts to dissolve. Ideas float past without attaching themselves to plot lines or chains of implication. Memory surfaces in fragments rather than sequences. The problem-solving drive becomes intermittent, its urgency ebbing in the intervals between its brief reactivations. The mind begins to move more like the mind of someone drifting rather than the mind of someone working. This is not a failure of the mind's capacities. This is the natural arc of mental momentum toward its own quieting. It is what the mind does when the conditions allow it, when the resistance to the movement is reduced, when the night does its slow and patient work. It is, if anything, a sign that the mind is beginning to find its way toward the mode that rest and renewal require. Elena has been lying quietly for some time now. The meeting is still present in her awareness, but differently than it was earlier. The quality of urgency that characterized the first hour has shifted. The meeting has not become less important, but the pressure to prepare for it right now, at this hour, in this particular way, has become less insistent. The thoughts about it are still there, but they are lighter, less demanding, less claiming of her entire attention. The meeting exists in the future, in its appropriate place. Tonight exists in the present. James has stopped running new scenarios. The arithmetic of possible futures that occupied the first part of the night has given way, somewhere in the last half hour, to something less structured and less driven. He is thinking about something from his childhood, a specific afternoon that he has not thought about in years. And though he could not say why that memory has surfaced, or what it has to do with the reorganization at work, it is there, gently, without urgency. The career uncertainty has not resolved. It remains in the background of things, a real and open question. But it has relinquished its grip on the foreground of his attention, and the grip released itself without any particular effort on his part. It simply eased. The mind is settling, not because it was instructed to, not because a technique was successfully applied, because this is what minds do when the conditions are right, when the resistance to their movement is reduced, when the night does what nights do, and the body does what bodies do, and the momentum that was set in motion by the day runs its natural arc toward quieter and quieter movement. There is something that deserves to be said about why the mind does not simply produce a neutral stream of information about events and circumstances. Why the meeting tomorrow is not simply a meeting, but carries with it the weight of what meetings have meant before, and what this particular one might mean for the future. Why the career uncertainty is not simply an open question, but feels like it touches something essential about identity and value, and what kind of person one turns out to be. The mind is not primarily an information processor, though it does process information with considerable efficiency. It is primarily a meaning-making instrument. It does not experience events as data points to be catalogued and stored. It experiences them as chapters in a narrative, embedded in a story that has a particular past and an imagined future, and a protagonist whose coherence across time the mind is continuously working to maintain. The self is a story the mind tells. that story must hang together. New events are perpetually being integrated into it, and events that threaten the coherence of the story create a particular kind of disturbance that goes deeper than ordinary concern. When something uncertain enters this narrative, the mind does not register it as a simple unknown to be filled in when information becomes available. It registers it as a potential disruption to the coherence of the ongoing story. The career reorganization is not merely an organizational event affecting a workplace. It is an event with implications for the chapter of the story that James is currently inhabiting, for the character he understands himself to be, for the trajectory of a life that has a meaning he is continuously constructing and revising. The night thinking is, in part, the mind doing the work of narrative maintenance, attempting to integrate the uncertain event into a story that can hold it without fracturing. This is why the thinking at night has such a different quality than the thinking required to solve a crossword puzzle or calculate a route on a map. Those are problems in the external world with defined parameters and available solutions. The night thinking is partly a problem in the self, in the narrative structure by which the mind organizes experience into something coherent and livable and meaningful. You cannot solve it by accumulating more information, because the real question it is addressing is not informational. It is existential in the most ordinary sense. Who am I in this situation? What does this mean for the story of my life? And can that story hold this new development without losing its shape? Schopenhauer observed, in his writing on human nature and the structure of the will, that the human being is unique among animals in the degree to which it suffers from imagination rather than from actual present circumstances. Other creatures are disturbed primarily by what is immediately and tangibly threatening. Human beings are disturbed by what might happen, what might have happened differently, what the present situation implies about the future, what the future implies about the quality of a life that is still being constructed. The suffering of imagination, Schopenhauer suggested, is inseparable from the remarkable cognitive capacity for temporal thinking, for inhabiting past and future as readily as present, that makes human intelligence extraordinary in its scope. He wrote, with his characteristic unsparingness, that makes his best work feel like being looked at very directly. The greatest wisdom is to make the enjoyment of the present the supreme object of life, because that is the only reality, all else being merely the play of thought. This is not hedonism. It is not a suggestion that nothing beyond the immediate moment should be attended to. It is a precise philosophical observation about the relationship between the mind's temporal reach and its tendency toward suffering. The present is the only location where experience actually occurs. Everything else, the past and the future, and the conditional worlds of might be and might have been, is constructed in thought. The mind that is entirely absorbed in the constructed worlds is a mind that is always, in a sense, absent from the only place where life is actually happening. The philosophical traditions we have explored tonight converge on this, each in their own vocabulary. The Stoic emphasis on the present as the only domain of genuine action. The Buddhist attention to the arising and passing of each moment as the actual texture of experience. The Taoist flow with whatever is happening as a way of inhabiting the present without fighting it. These are different expressions of the same recognition. The only place anyone has ever actually been is here, now, in this moment, and the mind that is perpetually elsewhere, perpetually in the constructed future or the examined past, is a mind that misses a great deal of its own experience. What the night hours would feel like if the mind could rest, even briefly, in the actual present moment. The weight of the blankets, the soft pressure of the mattress, the particular quality of darkness behind closed eyes, the sound of breathing, the temperature of the air against skin, not as background conditions to the more important business of planning tomorrow, but as the actual content of this actual moment, complete in themselves, requiring nothing added to them in order to be what they are. The present moment is always sufficient for what it is. It is only insufficient for what we are trying to make it be. There is a dimension of this experience that philosophical reflection does not often address directly, partly because it belongs to what the body knows, rather than what the mind can articulate. But it is present in this room, and it is doing its own quiet work alongside the thinking, and it deserves some acknowledgement. While the mind has been planning and worrying and constructing scenarios and running the ancient program of anticipation, the body has been pursuing its own priorities with characteristic patience and reliability. It has been lowering its core temperature by small degrees. It has been slowing the heart rate. It has been reducing the activity of certain metabolic systems and increasing the activity of others, the systems that handle repair and consolidation, and the maintenance of the biological structures that make everything else possible. It has been moving by degrees toward the physiological state that enables deep rest, not because the mind requested this, but because the body has its own intelligence, its own understanding of what the hour requires, its own way of moving through the cycle that has moved through it every day of its existence. The breath that is slower now than it was an hour ago did not become slower because you decided to slow it. It became slower because the body, in the absence of urgent physical demand, moved in its natural direction. The heaviness in the limbs did not require effort to produce. The warmth under the blankets did not require maintenance. These things happened because the body knows how to do them, has always known how to do them, and does them most effectively when the mind does not interfere with the process through sustained activation of the stress and urgency responses. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, were attentive to the relationship between mind and body, to the ways in which the quality of mental activity affected the health and functioning of the physical self. He wrote in his Meditations about the importance of attending to the body's needs without overvaluing them, of treating the body as a reliable partner in the project of living well, rather than either ignoring it or being dominated by its appetites. The night, with its clear message that the body needs rest and repair, is one of the times when that partnership is most directly relevant. The mind that insists on staying active when the body needs rest is exercising a kind of tyranny that costs both partners. There is a quiet wisdom in recognizing that the body is already doing what it needs to do, that the process of rest and renewal is already underway in the most literal physiological sense regardless of what the mind is doing. The rest of the night, whatever quality it takes, whatever degree of thought or quiet it contains, is contributing to that renewal. The body is not waiting for the mind to stop thinking before it begins its work. It has already begun. It will continue whether or not the mind reaches stillness. You do not have to earn the rest the body is providing. You do not have to achieve a particular quality of mind in order to deserve it. The body provides it regardless, as it provides everything else it provides. Breathing, circulation, temperature regulation, the continuous low hum of biological maintenance that goes largely unnoticed precisely because it proceeds without requiring attention. It is proceeding now. It has been proceeding since you lay down. Whatever the mind has done in these hours, the body has been, quietly and faithfully, doing what the body does in the dark, and will continue doing it through whatever remains of the night. There is something settling in that recognition, something that requires no philosophical argument to be felt. The night is not merely a period of time to be endured until sleep arrives, or to be successfully filled with enough philosophical reflection to justify the wakefulness. It is a space in which something valuable is happening in you already, something that does not require your active participation to proceed. The mind can rest in that knowledge the way the body rests in the mattress, by allowing itself to be supported by something that is already doing the supporting. It is worth considering briefly, without excessive weight, what tends to remain in the morning from a night of this kind of thinking. Not what should remain, not what would ideally remain, but what actually tends to remain as a matter of ordinary observation when the dark hours have passed and the light has changed and the day has re-established itself in its usual mode. Often, the specific scenarios that occupied the mind so completely through the night have lost some of their definition by morning. The conversations that were rehearsed in elaborate detail have simplified themselves. The complications that seemed to ramify endlessly in the dark have reduced to their actual dimensions, which are almost always more manageable than they appeared at 2 a.m. The future that seemed to require intensive and immediate preparation looks in the morning light like something that can be approached as it actually arrives, rather than needing to be fully pre-lived the night before. This is not because the concerns were unreal or unimportant. They were real and remain real in the morning. It is because the night amplifies certain qualities of thought that the morning naturally moderates. The darkness, by reducing the sensory input that ordinarily balances and contextualizes the mind's internal activity, allows the internal activity to take on a proportionally larger presence. The concerns expand to fill the available space, as Pascal noted. The mind, without the grounding of sensory engagement with the actual world, tends toward the abstract and the frightening. In the morning, with sensory input restored, with the day's routine providing its anchoring context, the same concerns occupy their proper proportions again. The philosophers we have visited tonight understood versions of this. Epictetus, with his observation that we are disturbed by our opinions about things rather than by the things themselves, was implicitly noting that the night, by stripping away the distractions that ordinarily keep those opinions from being felt so directly, reveals the mechanism with unusual clarity. The morning, with its distractions restored, does not change the opinions, but changes how prominently they dominate the field of awareness. Marcus Aurelius's practice of reviewing the day and attending to the mind's condition before sleep was, in part, an attempt to maintain the kind of perspective that the darkness tends to narrow. The morning does not resolve what was unresolved at night. The meeting will still happen. The reorganization will still need to be navigated. The application will still be waiting for its outcome. But the morning brings a quality of presence and proportion that the night, by its nature, tends to diminish. The rest of the night, whatever quality it takes, contributes to that morning presence in ways that cannot be engineered from within the anxiety that resists rest. The most useful thing the night can do for tomorrow is to allow the body and the mind to move, at whatever pace is natural, toward the quieter and more rested state that makes tomorrow's challenges addressable. So there is something to be said for allowing the night to do what nights do, for trusting that the morning will be what the morning is, that the concerns which feel so large and so urgent in the dark will still be there to be addressed when the light returns, at their actual size, available to the actual capabilities of a mind and body that have been given what they needed to rest. We have covered a considerable distance together tonight, from the first recognition that the mind continues its momentum after the day ends, through the evolutionary origins of the problem-solving drive, and why it was shaped to be persistent rather than easily satisfied, through the observations of Stoics and Taoists and Buddhist thinkers and Pascal and Schopenhauer, who each, in their different ways and from their different positions, noticed and named the restless mind with care, through the Epictetan distinction between what is and is not in our control, and the implications of that distinction for the particular anxieties of night thinking, through the subtle but significant distinction between being inside thought and observing that thought is happening, through the Taoist understanding of natural settling and the way that resistance to movement tends to perpetuate rather than resolve it. We have moved through all of this slowly, because slow movement is appropriate to the hour and appropriate to the subject. Ideas about the nature of mind and the quality of inner experience are not well served by speed. They require the kind of sustained, unhurried attention that is difficult to maintain during the day, but that becomes naturally available when the day has ended and the quiet has arrived. What has emerged across all of these different traditions and perspectives and centuries is something that is not a technique and not a set of instructions to be practiced in sequence. It is more like a widened understanding of what is happening when the mind moves restlessly through the night. It is a kind of philosophical companionship with the experience, a way of being with the restless mind that is different from both helpless captivity to its movement and futile battle against it. Understanding does not silence the mind, but it changes the relationship to the movement. And in that changed relationship, the movement becomes something different. Not less real, not less present, but held differently, received into a wider context, seen as something that has origins and natural arcs, and that participates in something much larger than the particular concern that currently animates it. Marcus Aurelius, in what might be one of his most personally arrived at observations, wrote simply, "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul." This is one of his more intimate statements. Not a command or an exhortation, but a discovery, something he arrived at through years of practical philosophy, applied to the real and demanding texture of a life under extraordinary pressure. The quiet is not somewhere you go. It is not a location or a state to be achieved through effort. It is something already present within the structure of awareness itself, not in the thoughts, but in the capacity within which thoughts arise and pass. Not the content of consciousness, but its ground. This is difficult to locate from within the activity of an anxious mind. It is particularly difficult to locate when the thoughts are loud and urgent, and when the night has not yet had enough hours to soften their edges. But it is not a mystical or obscure claim. It is a straightforward observation about the structure of experience that careful attention reveals. Awareness is not the same as the thought. The one who observes the restless mind is not itself restless in the way the mind is. There is a quality of steadiness in the observing that is qualitatively different from the thing observed, even when the observed thing is moving very quickly. When Priya, in the dark, suddenly finds herself noticing that she has been thinking in circles for some extended time, there is a moment in that noticing that has a different quality than the circle itself. She is not inside the circle in that moment. She is at some remove from it, seeing it from a slightly different place. That place is what Marcus Aurelius is pointing to as a possible retreat. Not withdrawal from life or from responsibility, but a return to the observing capacity itself, to the awareness that is always already present, and that is, by its nature, somewhat more stable than its rapidly moving contents. The Taoist tradition returns here as well, though it uses different language and approaches from a different angle. Zhuangzi's philosopher does not struggle with the river of circumstances. He does not try to stop it or reverse it or dam it into predictable channels. He learns its currents and moves accordingly. There is a kind of ease available to the mind that has stopped fighting its own nature, that has allowed the patterns of thought to be what they are, while remaining in some relationship with the stillness that underlies them, the stillness that Marcus Aurelius found in his own soul, and that Laozi described as the condition from which the universe becomes knowable. The philosophical tradition we have been inhabiting tonight is not one tradition. It is many traditions, arising in different centuries and different geographies, speaking different languages, operating with different assumptions about the nature of reality and the purpose of human life. And yet across all of these differences, something consistent emerges when the subject is the restless mind, the wandering thought, the night thinking that will not resolve. Something that might be called a convergence of careful observation. That convergence says, in its various voices, the movement of mind is natural and has ancient origins. The urgency that the movement carries is often more a feature of the mind's condition than an accurate signal from external reality. The attempt to force the mind into stillness tends to produce more activity rather than less. The distinction between being inside thought and observing thought is real and available, and changes something in the quality of experience. The uncertain future, to which so much night thinking is directed, does not yield to the application of more thought. And within all of this, there is a quality of awareness, of steadiness, of ground that is present even when the surface is agitated, and that can be found by those who look for it carefully. It is late now, or early, depending on how you count time in the dark hours that belong to neither yesterday nor tomorrow. The room is as it was when this began. The soft weight of the blankets, the slight pressure of the mattress, the temperature of the air, which has its own quality at this hour, a degree cooler than the evening, a degree warmer than the pre-dawn. The darkness has settled into its deepest version. The sounds of the world outside have reached their quietest point. The breath is slower than it was. Or perhaps it has been this slow for a while, and you are only noticing it now because some part of attention has returned from its forward deployment into the future, and is here, briefly, in the simple fact of breathing. In and out, the body conducting its ancient business of maintenance and repair, indifferent to the questions that the mind has been turning over, proceeding at its own pace through the hours. Eleanor's meeting will happen tomorrow. She is, in some real sense, more ready for it than she would have been without the night's thinking, even the circular portions of it. The mind did some useful work even in its restless mode. It identified real concerns. It prepared her attention for what will be required. And she is also somewhat rested, which is its own form of readiness. The night held her. The thinking and the resting proceeded together, as they do. James will face his uncertainty in the morning. The reorganization will proceed on its own schedule, according to forces that include but extend beyond his own contribution. He cannot control the outcome. He can influence some of the factors that will shape it. He can show up tomorrow with the quality of presence that rest makes possible. He can hold the uncertainty with something closer to equanimity than it had an hour ago, not because the uncertainty has resolved, but because the night has done some work on the relationship between him and the uncertainty. That is not nothing. It may, in the long run, be more important than any additional planning. Priya will wait. The waiting is not an empty interval between real events. It is the time that surrounds a completed action, allowing it to have its effects in the world according to the world's own rhythms. She has done what she could do. The rest is genuinely beyond her, and there is a kind of cleanness in that, once the mind releases its grip on the need to do more. The application was honest and capable. Whether it succeeds in this particular instance or not, she knows what she produced. That self-knowledge is durable in a way that the outcome, whatever it turns out to be, is not. The Buddhist teachings on the settling of mind return here in their gentlest form, the image of the pond in which sediment has been disturbed. When the disturbance stops, the sediment settles. The water does not clear itself through effort or through wanting to be clear. It clears because that is its nature, because the settling is the direction that the water naturally moves in when nothing is stirring it. The clarity was present all along beneath the sediment. The settling does not create the clarity. It reveals it. There is something worth holding gently in that image. The restless mind tonight, for all its motion, for all the urgency it has carried through the dark hours, is not a fundamentally different thing from the quiet mind. It is the same mind in a particular condition. The condition will change. The change is already in process, has been in process since the first thoughts of the night began their natural arc toward slower movement. The clarity that the quiet mind carries was there all along. It is being revealed as the sediment settles. You have been with these words for some time now. The ideas have moved through you in the particular way that ideas move through a person in a contemplative state, which is different from the way they move through someone sitting at a desk with a pen and a purpose. They have entered through a more open door. They have found whatever space was available to them, without being assigned specific rooms or required to produce immediate outputs. Some of them will remain. Some will have passed through without leaving a visible trace, though they may have shifted something subtle in the way the terrain is arranged. You do not need to retain all of this. Philosophy absorbed in a contemplative late-night state enters differently than philosophy studied in daylight. It goes somewhere less deliberate and perhaps more durable. It enters the way that a long conversation with a thoughtful person enters, not as a set of propositions to be remembered, but as a quality of perspective that was gradually transferred in the exchange, and that will surface unpredictably in future moments when something in the present situation calls it forth. What remains, as the words slow and the space between them widens, is something quite simple, a few things known a little more fully than they were at the beginning of the night. The mind that moves is doing what minds do. The urgency it carries is partly a feature of its own condition, and not entirely an accurate report of external reality. The things it worries about are mostly things it cannot control through more worry. The awareness that observes all of this is, in some important sense, already quieter than what it observes. And the settling is already in process, has been in process all along, proceeding according to its own natural pace. Nothing must be solved tonight. Let that settle for a moment without argument, not as a consolation offered to someone who has tried and failed to solve something, not as permission to be irresponsible about real concerns, but as a genuine and clear-eyed recognition of what this hour actually requires. The future that the mind has been preparing for will arrive on its own schedule. The decisions that need to be made will be made in daylight, with whatever information is then available, by the person you will be then, in the state that tomorrow's morning will produce. Tonight is tonight. The problems of tomorrow belong to tomorrow, and tomorrow is better served by rest than by another hour of incomplete rehearsal. The mind is allowed to move, not because movement is ideal, or because more thought is needed, or because the circling serves a purpose that justifies the cost it extracts, but because fighting the movement is its own kind of agitation, and the natural arc of things is toward settling, and the settling will come in its own time if the resistance does not perpetually renew itself. The thought that arises can be allowed to arise. It does not require combat. It requires only the quality of noticing that we explored in the earlier hours, the slight stepping back from full identification, the small degree of distance between the observer and the observed. Understanding unfolds slowly. The ideas encountered tonight will not be retained in full tomorrow morning. They will not sit in memory as a set of usable principles waiting to be deployed. They will do something more gradual and less visible than that. They will change, by small degrees, the quality of relationship between you and the experience of a moving mind. The next time you lie awake with thoughts that will not quiet, something in how you are with those thoughts may be slightly different. Not transformed, not healed, not permanently resolved into some superior mode of being, simply slightly different in quality, slightly more companionable with the movement, slightly less adversarial toward it, slightly more aware that what is happening has origins, has natural arcs, has been happening to thoughtful people for as long as there have been thoughtful people, and that the experience of it, whatever discomfort it carries, is also a kind of company. Rest is not the absence of thought. This is worth saying once more, quietly, at the end of all these hours. Rest is not the achievement of an empty mind. The mind is not empty. It continues its activity, but that activity can proceed at a lower intensity, in a softer mode, at the frequency of the half-awake rather than the fully engaged, the associative rather than the analytical, the floating rather than the driven. The body can rest even while the mind still moves. The essential processes of repair and renewal that sleep and near sleep enable can proceed even in the company of thought. You do not have to achieve perfect mental stillness to receive what the night is offering. Rest is the gentle easing of urgency. That is the most accurate description. Not the cessation of activity, not the forced silencing of content, but the gradual release of the pressure that has been driving the activity, the reduction of the sense that something must be resolved, that the future must be secured, that the thinking must produce an output. When the urgency eases, the thinking continues, but differently. It becomes the kind of thinking that is compatible with rest, that moves at the pace of the body's own deepening quiet rather than fighting against it. The grip loosens, not through effort, not through technique, but gradually as the night deepens and the breath slows and the vast machinery of daily concern runs lower and lower on the fuel that the day supplied. The meeting is still there, but it is lighter. The career uncertainty is still present, but it has relinquished its claim on the foreground of attention. The submitted application is still out in the world, waiting for what it waits for, but the mind is no longer gripping it with the same intensity as it was an hour ago. Something has eased. It happened without announcement. Laozi, in one of his most compact observations, wrote, "Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? The patience is not an effortful waiting, not a gritted teeth endurance of the period before clarity arrives. It is closer to a quality of trust in the natural direction of things. The mud will settle. That is what mud does. The patience required is not the patience of strain, but the patience of allowing, of not stirring the water again in the anxiety of waiting for it to clear. The room is quiet. The world outside continues its nocturnal hum, that distant ambient sound that marks the city's nighttime presence, the hum of machines that never stop, of traffic on roads far enough away that individual vehicles have merged into a continuous low note. It is a sound that suggests the presence of other people in their own nights, their own rooms, their own particular versions of this universal experience. You are here. The mind is here with you. The long and distinguished tradition of careful thought about this experience of being a thoughtful creature in the dark, the Stoics and the Taoists and the Buddhists and the solitary philosophers writing by candlelight or lamplight, or the light of early morning. They are here too, in whatever sense ideas can be present across the distance of time. Their understanding passed into their words passed through centuries of reading and copying and translation and interpretation. These words carry something of that transmission, imperfectly and at several removes, but carrying it nonetheless. What remains is simply this moment, and then the next one, and then the next. The mind in its gentle and increasingly quiet motion, the body in its patient and unhurried rest, the night doing what nights do, holding everything steadily in the dark, allowing the settling to proceed at its own pace, indifferent to how long it takes, offering its hours to whoever is in them with the same unhurried generosity that it offers to those already asleep. There is nothing more required of this hour than what it already is. Nothing offered here tonight was a method. There is no practice to install, no technique to carry into tomorrow, no resolution that needs to be achieved before the night is considered successfully spent. Philosophy, in its most honest form, does not provide quick relief or efficient solutions to the difficulties of inner life. It provides something slower and more durable, a widened understanding of where we are and what we are doing, a sense of companionship across time with the thoughtful people who have examined the same territory and left careful records of what they found. If something settled as you moved through these words, if the urgency of a particular thought became fractionally lighter, if the quality of your relationship to the moving mind shifted in some small way, that was the natural consequence of sustained, unhurried attention in a quiet space. The ideas created certain conditions. The conditions supported something that was already present. The settling was always going to happen. The night was always going to do its work. If you are still awake and thinking, that too is exactly as it should be. The mind has been given good company tonight. It has been in the presence of careful thought about the very thing it is doing. Some understanding moves through us without announcing itself, without producing a noticeable moment of arrival. It simply becomes part of how we see, part of the context within which the next experience of a restless mind will unfold. The night continues. The breath continues. There is nothing more required of this hour than what it already is. Rest, when it comes, is welcome. Thought, while it continues, is simply the mind being a mind. Ancient, restless, meaning-making, always in motion, capable of great clarity, never finally resolved, irreducibly alive. The mind that has been with you through these hours, turning over its concerns and its plans and its uncertainties. That mind is not your adversary. It is the instrument through which you experience everything that is worth experiencing. Its restlessness tonight is evidence not of a flaw, but of the same capacity that allows you to love people and solve problems and understand ideas and feel the weight of what matters. The capacity for depth and the capacity for nighttime worry are not separate things. They are the same thing in different modes. Both are allowed. Both are ordinary. Both are, in the long and patient view of the philosophical tradition that has been your company tonight, deeply and quietly and permanently human. This is what it looks like, from the inside, to be alive and thoughtful in the small hours, a mind in motion, a body at rest, a room holding both of them, the night doing its work, the hours passing in their unhurried sequence. Nothing extraordinary is required. Nothing exceptional needs to occur. You are already in the only place that matters, which is here. You are already doing the only thing the hour requires, which is to be present in it, however the presence looks, however the mind chooses to occupy the time between now and the morning. The tradition says, in all its different voices, "This is enough. You are enough. The night is enough. The settling, when it comes, will find you exactly where you are."